What we often misunderstand about decay is that medieval builders understood it better than we do. Modern assumptions about wood are shaped by industrial experience. Timber is treated as a temporary material, something to be sealed with chemicals, replaced when it softens, and protected from moisture at all costs. The prevailing belief is simple. Water causes rot, and dryness preserves. Yet surviving medieval structures quietly contradict that logic. Oak beams laid down 8 centuries ago still hold weight. Ship timbers pulled from riverbeds remain structurally sound. Entire churches stand on wooden foundations that should, by modern expectations, have failed long ago. The contradiction is not accidental. Medieval builders were not working with inferior science. They were working with a different model of decay, one based on observation rather than abstraction. They understood that rot is not caused by water alone, but by the presence of oxygen, fungi, and the conditions that allow both to thrive. In other words, they were not trying to eliminate moisture. They were trying to control the environment in which wood existed. This distinction shaped a set of practices that modern construction largely abandoned, not because they were ineffective, but because they required patience, local knowledge, and a level of environmental awareness that industrial systems do not reward. What survives today is not just old timber, but the evidence of a different approach to material longevity, one that prioritized stability over convenience. They preserved wood by placing it in conditions where decay could not begin. One of the most counterintuitive practices in medieval construction was the deliberate use of water as a preservative. In regions with high water tables or unstable soil, builders often drove wooden piles deep into the ground until they reached permanently saturated layers. These piles, typically made from oak or alder, were not protected from moisture. They were immersed in it. The reasoning becomes clear when examined through the lens of decay biology. The fungi responsible for rot require oxygen to break down wood fibers. In fully waterlogged conditions, oxygen is effectively excluded. The environment becomes anaerobic, halting the biological processes that lead to decay. As long as the wood remains submerged, it does not rot in the conventional sense. This principle is visible in the survival of medieval bridge foundations, waterfront structures, and even entire urban districts built on timber piles. The key variable was consistency. Wood that cycles between wet and dry conditions deteriorates rapidly. Wood that remains continuously saturated can endure for centuries. For survival-minded builders, the lesson is not simply that water preserves wood, it is that stability of environment matters more than the environment itself. Medieval builders did not fear water. They feared fluctuation. Their methods aimed to eliminate the transitions that accelerate decay. They used fire not as a destructive force, but as a controlled tool for preservation. Another overlooked technique was the controlled charring of wood surfaces. This was not accidental burning, but a deliberate process in which the outer layer of timber was exposed to flame until it formed a thin, carbonized shell. The result was a material that resisted moisture, insects, and microbial activity. The effectiveness of this method lies in the chemical transformation that occurs during charring. Heat breaks down the volatile compounds in wood, leaving behind a layer rich in carbon. This layer is hydrophobic, meaning it repels water, and it is inhospitable to fungi and insects. In practical terms, it functions as a natural barrier, one that does not rely on applied coatings or ongoing maintenance. Evidence of this practice appears in preserved fence posts, structural beams, and even maritime components. It was particularly useful in areas where wood was exposed to soil contact or intermittent moisture, conditions that would normally accelerate decay. The broader implication is that medieval builders did not treat wood as a static material. They modified it to suit its environment. Fire, in this context, was not a threat to be avoided, but a tool to be applied with precision. The goal was not to prevent exposure, but to harden the material against it. They relied on the internal chemistry of trees rather than external treatments. Long before synthetic preservatives, medieval builders exploited the natural defenses already present within wood. Different species were selected not only for strength, but for their chemical composition. Oak, for example, contains high levels of tannins, compounds that inhibit fungal growth and deter insects. Pine and other conifers produce resins that act as natural sealants. These properties were not fully understood in chemical terms, but they were recognized through experience. Builders knew which woods lasted in certain conditions and which failed. Over time, this knowledge became embedded in regional construction practices. In some cases, these natural compounds were supplemented with additional treatments. Oils derived from plants, animal fats, and resin mixtures were applied to surfaces to enhance water resistance. These were not universal solutions, but targeted interventions based on specific environmental challenges. What distinguishes this approach is its reliance on compatibility rather than resistance. Modern treatments often attempt to overpower natural processes with synthetic barriers. Medieval methods worked with the material's inherent properties, reinforcing what was already present rather than introducing foreign substances. They controlled when trees were cut, understanding that timing affected durability. One of the more subtle factors in wood preservation was the timing of tree felling. Medieval builders often harvested timber during the winter months, when sap levels were lowest. This practice reduced the moisture content and nutrient availability within the wood, making it less attractive to fungi and insects. The difference is not immediately visible, but it has long-term consequences. Wood cut during periods of high sap flow contains more sugars and organic compounds that can support microbial growth. By selecting the right season, builders effectively reduced the likelihood of decay before the wood was even shaped or installed. This practice required coordination and patience. Timber had to be prepared months in advance of construction, and storage conditions had to prevent unwanted moisture fluctuations. It was not an efficient system by modern standards, but it produced materials that were inherently more stable. For those studying historical resilience, the lesson is clear. Durability begins long before construction. It is embedded in the selection and preparation of materials, not just their final application. They designed structures to manage water rather than exclude it entirely. Medieval architecture reflects a consistent principle. Water will enter any structure given enough time. The goal, therefore, was not absolute exclusion, but controlled movement. Roof designs directed runoff away from vulnerable areas. Overhangs protected walls from direct exposure. Foundations were shaped to prevent standing water from accumulating. These design choices worked in conjunction with the material treatments already described. A charred beam resists moisture, but it performs better when shielded from constant saturation. A waterlogged foundation remains stable, but only if it is not subjected to repeated drying. This integrated approach reduced the burden on any single technique. Preservation was not dependent on one method, but on the interaction of multiple strategies. Each addressed a different aspect of the decay process, creating a system that was more resilient than its individual components. They accepted maintenance as part of longevity, not as a sign of failure. Another difference between medieval and modern approaches lies in expectations. Structures were not built with the assumption of permanence without intervention. Maintenance was understood as a continuous process, not a reactive measure. Timber elements were inspected, repaired, and, when necessary, replaced in a controlled manner. This prevented localized damage from spreading and allowed structures to adapt to changing conditions. The goal was not to avoid all decay, but to manage it. This perspective aligns with survival-oriented thinking. Longevity is not achieved through a single act of construction, but through ongoing attention. Materials endure when they are part of a system that anticipates change rather than resisting it. What these methods reveal is a different relationship with materials and environment. Taken together, these practices form a coherent philosophy. Medieval builders did not attempt to dominate their environment. They worked within its constraints, using observation to guide their decisions. Water, fire, and biological processes were not treated as enemies, but as variables to be managed. This approach produced results that really challenge modern assumptions. Timber structures that should have failed, they remain intact. Techniques that were dismissed as primitive actually proved to be effective under conditions that defeat contemporary solutions. The relevance here extends beyond just historical curiosity. In situations where industrial materials are unavailable or unsustainable, these methods offer viable alternatives. They rely on accessible resources and fundamental principles rather than specialized products. For those concerned with resilience, the value lies not just in the techniques themselves, but in the mindset they represent. Understanding the conditions that lead to decay allows for solutions that are adaptable, scalable, and grounded in reality. This is why these overlooked practices still matter in a modern context. The survival of medieval timber is not an anomaly. It is the result of deliberate choices informed by experience. As modern construction faces challenges related to sustainability, resource constraints, and environmental instability, these older methods become increasingly relevant. They remind us that durability is not solely a function of technology. It's a function of understanding, of how materials interact with their surroundings, and how those interactions can be shaped over time. Revisiting these practices does not require abandoning modern knowledge. It requires integrating it with insights that have been, for the most part, largely set aside. The goal isn't to replicate the past, but to learn from it in ways that address present and future needs. The wooden structures that have endured for centuries are not relics of a lost world. They're evidence of a disciplined approach to building, one that prioritized observation, adaptation, and long-term thinking over immediate convenience. Understanding how medieval builders preserved wood is not simply an exercise in historical analysis. It's a reminder that resilience often depends on principles that are, frankly, easy to overlook. Stability over speed, compatibility over control, preparation over reaction. If this kind of in-depth historical perspective is something you value, consider subscribing to Hidden in History and sharing this video with others who are looking for more than surface-level accounts.